Hey everyone, today we dive into the chilling darkness of mass paranoia and execution. The story of the Salem witch trials. What really happened during those terrifying months in 1692 when neighbor turned against neighbor, when fear consumed an entire community, and when 20 innocent people paid with their lives for crimes that existed only in the fevered imaginations of a panicked town. The incredible story of the Salem witch trials is stranger than fiction, and everything you think you know about this dark chapter is about to change. So before we dive in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now get comfortable, grab something to drink, and let's experience this incredible story together, because what you're about to discover will reveal the most terrifying truth of all myths, that the real monsters weren't supernatural, they were human. Picture this. It's a bitter cold January morning in 1692 in Salem Village, Massachusetts. The Puritan settlement is blanketed in snow that crunches underfoot, and the wooden houses creak and groan against the harsh winter winds that cut through the settlement like knives. The air is so cold it burns your lungs, and smoke rises from chimneys in thin, desperate columns against the gray sky. Inside the parsonage of Reverend Samuel Parris, a stern man with piercing eyes and a reputation for harsh sermons, something deeply disturbing is happening that will change the course of American history forever. His 9-year-old daughter Betty, normally a quiet, obedient child, is writhing on the floor of the kitchen, her small body contorting in ways that seem to defy the laws of nature. Her screams pierce the winter air as she claims invisible creatures are pinching and biting her flesh, leaving marks that the adults can see but cannot explain. Beside her is 11-year-old niece Abigail Williams, who had been orphaned and taken in by the Parris family, is speaking in tongues, her voice changing pitch and timbre as she utters words that sound like no earthly language. The two girls are throwing what witnesses later describe as hellish fits, their bodies jerking and spasming as if controlled by some malevolent force. Reverend Parris, a man who had already made numerous enemies in the deeply divided community through his harsh leadership style and demands for higher pay, watches in horror as his own household becomes the epicenter of what appears to be supernatural warfare. His wife Elizabeth is weeping, his enslaved woman Tituba is muttering prayers in her native language, and neighbors are gathering outside, their faces pressed against the frost-covered windows, trying to catch a glimpse of the spectacle within. The adults watching have no idea they're witnessing the spark that will ignite one of history's most infamous witch hunts, a conflagration that will consume their community and leave scars that persist to this day. But here's where the story becomes truly fascinating, because the events in that parsonage weren't happening in isolation. Salem Village in 1692 was a powder keg of social tensions, economic disputes, and religious extremism just waiting for a spark. The community was split down the middle by bitter feuds that had been simmering for years. On one side were the Putnams, led by the influential Thomas Putnam, who controlled much of the village's political power and supported Reverend Parris. On the other side were the Porters, wealthy merchants who opposed Parris and wanted him removed from his position. These weren't just disagreements about church policy, they were battles over land, money, and power that had turned neighbors into enemies. The broader context makes what happened next even more chilling. Massachusetts Bay Colony was in chaos. The old colonial charter had been revoked, leaving the colony without a stable government. King William's War was raging on the frontier, with French and Indian raids bringing violence terrifyingly close to home. Refugees from the fighting had flooded into Salem, straining resources and creating tension with the established residents. The rigid Puritan social order was showing cracks as economic changes created new wealth for some families while leaving others behind. Into this volatile atmosphere came the mysterious affliction of two young girls and the adults' desperate search for someone to blame. Reverend Parris, increasingly desperate as his daughter's condition worsened and his own position in the community became more precarious, calls for the village doctor, William Griggs. Griggs is an elderly man who had served the community for years, treating everything from broken bones to difficult births. But when he examines Betty and Abigail, feeling their pulses, looking into their eyes, checking their bodies for signs of illness or injury, he finds nothing. No fever, no physical wounds that would explain their behavior, no medical condition that could account for their bizarre symptoms. After exhausting all his medical knowledge, Griggs delivers the diagnosis that will seal the fate of 20 people. The evil hand is upon them. In the rigid Puritan worldview, where every unexplained event was seen as either God's blessing or Satan's curse, this can only mean one thing: witchcraft. The diagnosis spreads through Salem village like wildfire. In the meeting house, in the taverns, in the homes where families gather around their hearths, people whisper about the Paris girls and what their affliction might mean. Some of the more skeptical residents suggest the girls might be faking their symptoms, but they're quickly silenced by the majority who see questioning the reality of witchcraft as dangerously close to heresy. The Puritan belief system left no room for doubt. If Satan wasn't real, if witches weren't actively working to destroy Christian communities, then their entire worldview would collapse. But here's where things get really interesting, because what happened next reveals the complex web of social tensions, personal vendettas, and carefully calculated accusations that had been building in Salem village for years. The two girls, now the center of intense adult attention in a society that normally ignored children completely, begin naming names. They claim they can see the specters of certain women in the village tormenting them, invisible to everyone else but crystal clear to their afflicted eyes. The first person they accuse is Tituba, Reverend Paris's enslaved woman from Barbados, who had reportedly been telling the girls fortune-telling stories and folk tales during the long winter evenings when the family gathered around the fire. Now, Tituba is a fascinating figure, whose background adds layers of complexity to this story. She had been brought to Salem from the Caribbean, where she had grown up immersed in a rich tradition of folk magic, storytelling, and spiritual practices that blended African, indigenous, and European elements. To the Puritan children of Salem, her stories of spirits and magic were exotic and thrilling, a welcome escape from the harsh realities of their rigidly controlled lives. But to the adults, particularly as the witch hysteria began to build, these same stories became evidence of her dangerous influence over innocent children. The second accusation targets Sarah Good, a homeless beggar who had been reduced to going door to door asking for food and shelter. Sarah's fall from respectability had been swift and brutal. She had once been part of a prosperous family, but her father's death and her mother's remarriage had left her with little inheritance. Her first husband had died deeply in debt, and her second husband, William Good, was widely regarded as lazy and worthless. The couple had been reduced to begging, moving from house to house, sleeping in barns and abandoned buildings. Sarah had developed a reputation for muttering curses under her breath when people refused to help her, and her disheveled appearance and bitter demeanor made her an easy target for supernatural accusations. The third accusation falls on Sarah Osborne, an elderly woman who had scandalized the community by living with a man before marrying him, and who rarely attended church services. Osborne had been bedridden for months with illness, making her an unlikely candidate for nocturnal flights to witches' sabbaths, but her absence from church and her unconventional relationship had marked her as someone outside the community's moral boundaries. Her wealth also made her a target. Plus, she owned valuable property that others coveted, and accusations of witchcraft could potentially transfer that wealth to more deserving community members. Notice the pattern here, and this is crucial to understanding what was really happening in Salem. These first three accusations didn't target random members of the community. They targeted the most vulnerable people in Salem village: an enslaved woman with no legal rights, a homeless beggar with no social standing, and a bedridden woman who had violated social norms. These weren't random choices by confused children. These were calculated accusations that reflected the deep social fractures and prejudices already present in the community. The accusers, whether consciously or unconsciously, had chosen targets who couldn't effectively defend themselves and who already existed on the margins of Salem society. But what the accusers didn't anticipate was how Tituba would respond when brought before the magistrates. This is where the story takes a turn that nobody expected, and Tituba's response would transform a local crisis into a colony-wide catastrophe. On March 1st, 1692, Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne were brought before magistrates John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin in Salem Village's meeting house. The building was packed with spectators, the air thick with tension, and the smell of unwashed bodies pressed too close together. The magistrates, both wealthy and influential men who saw themselves as engaged in cosmic warfare against Satan's forces, were determined to get to the bottom of the witchcraft accusations. Sarah Good, despite her dire circumstances, maintained her innocence with fierce determination. When asked if she had made a contract with the devil, she replied with characteristic bluntness, "I make no contract with the devil. I never saw the devil in my life." When pressed about why she hurt the children, she shot back, "I do not hurt them. I scorn it." Her defiance, rather than helping her case, only convinced the magistrates that she was lying to protect her coven. Sarah Osborne, weak from illness and confused by the proceedings, also denied the charges, but her frail voice and obvious distress were interpreted as signs of guilt rather than innocence. Then came Tituba's moment, and what she said next would change everything. While the other two women had maintained their innocence, Tituba shocked everyone by confessing, but her confession was far more elaborate and terrifying than anyone had expected. In a voice that grew stronger as she spoke, she told the packed meeting house about her encounters with supernatural forces. She described a tall man from Boston who had appeared to her, commanding her to serve him and threatening her with violence if she refused. She spoke of red cats and red rats, of yellow birds that served as familiars for other witches, of rides through the night sky to gatherings where the devil himself presided over unholy ceremonies. But here's the detail that changed everything. Tituba claimed there were other witches in the community. Witches who were still hidden, still practicing their dark arts in secret. She described seeing the marks of other witches in the Devil's Book, telling the magistrates that Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne were just two members of a larger coven. When pressed for more details, she painted a picture of a vast conspiracy of evil hiding within Salem village itself, with respectable community members secretly serving Satan while maintaining their facades of Christian piety. This confession transformed the entire nature of the crisis. Suddenly, the witch hunt wasn't about 3 isolated cases of supernatural assault. It was about a vast conspiracy of evil that had infiltrated the very heart of the community. Tituba's vivid descriptions of supernatural encounters, likely influenced by her Caribbean background and the folk traditions she had grown up with, provided the template for what witchcraft looked like in Salem. Her detailed accounts of devil worship, magical flights, and supernatural creatures gave the community a shared vocabulary for describing the invisible war they believed was being waged around them. More importantly, her claim that other witches existed, that there were more names in the Devil's Book, gave the accusers permission to keep naming names. The hysteria that had started with 2 girls in a parsonage was about to consume an entire community, and Tituba's confession had provided the roadmap for its expansion. The magistrates, convinced they had uncovered the tip of a massive conspiracy, began pressing her for more names, more details, more evidence of the supernatural network that threatened their community. But here's what makes this story even more chilling. The accusations didn't remain confined to the 3 women who had been initially targeted. As word of the confessions spread through Salem Village and the neighboring towns, other young women began experiencing similar symptoms. The affliction seemed to be spreading, and with it, the circle of accusers expanded far beyond Betty Paris and Abigail Williams. Ann Putnam Jr., the 12-year-old daughter of one of Salem's most influential families, began having fits and visions. Mary Walcott, Mercy Lewis, Elizabeth Hubbard, and Susanna Sheldon all claimed to be tormented by witches' specters. Elizabeth Booth, Sarah Churchill, and Mary Warren joined the growing circle of afflicted accusers. What's particularly fascinating about this expansion is how it reflected the existing social networks and power structures in Salem Village. The Putnam family, one of the most influential families in the community, became central to the expanding accusations. Thomas Putnam was a wealthy landowner who had been locked in bitter disputes with rival families for years. His wife, Ann Putnam Sr., had lost several children in infancy and had developed a deep bitterness toward neighbors she blamed for her family's misfortunes. When their daughter Ann Jr. began experiencing visions and making accusations, the family threw their considerable social weight behind the witch hunt. Ann Putnam Jr., despite her young age, became one of the most prolific accusers in Salem's history, eventually naming 62 people as witches. Her accusations weren't random, they followed the fault lines of her family's disputes and grievances. Many of the people she named were connected to the Porter family, the Putnams' main rivals in Salem Village. Others were people who had crossed her family in business dealings, land disputes, or church politics. What was happening wasn't just mass hysteria. It was the weaponization of supernatural terror to settle earthly scores. The story takes an even more sinister turn when we examine how the accusations began targeting increasingly prominent members of the community. The initial focus on social outcasts like Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne had been relatively safe. Few people would rally to defend a homeless beggar or a bedridden woman who rarely attended church. But as the circle of accusations widened, it began to include people who had real standing in the community, people with families and friends who would fight for them. Martha Corey was one of the first respectable community members to be accused, and her case reveals how the witch hunt had evolved into something far more dangerous than anyone had initially imagined. Corey was a church member in good standing, a woman known for her sharp wit and independent thinking, but it was precisely her independence that made her a target. When the accusations first began, Corey had dared to question their validity, suggesting that the afflicted girls might be mistaken or even lying. In the charged atmosphere of Salem in 1692, such skepticism was seen as deeply suspicious. If Martha Corey questioned the reality of the witch threat, the reasoning went, perhaps she was trying to protect her fellow coven members. When Corey was examined on March 21, 1692, the meeting house was even more packed than usual. The community was divided. Some came to support a woman they had known and respected for years, while others came to witness the exposure of what they believed was a dangerous deceiver. Ann Putnam Jr. took center stage, claiming that Corey's specter was at that very moment trying to force her to sign the devil's book. The young girl writhed and screamed, pointing at empty air and begging the invisible Martha Corey to stop tormenting her. The magistrates, already convinced of the reality of spectral evidence, saw Corey's calm demeanor and continued protestations of innocence as further proof of her guilt. When she laughed at some of the more outrageous accusations, they interpreted her laughter as mockery of the court and evidence of her alliance with evil forces. The fact that she was a church member, far from helping her case, actually made her seem more dangerous. After all, Satan's most effective servants would be those who had successfully infiltrated the community of the faithful. But the moment that truly showed how far the hysteria had spread, how completely it had consumed the community's ability to think rationally, came when Rebecca Nurse was accused. This accusation sent shockwaves through Salem Village because Nurse was everything that the previous accused women were not. She was a 71-year-old grandmother, a devout Christian who had been a pillar of the community for decades. She was known for her kindness, her piety, her gentle nature, and her willingness to help neighbors in times of trouble. She had raised 8 children, all of whom had grown up to be respectable members of the community. She was exactly the kind of person that everyone in Salem Village aspired to be. When Ann Putnam Jr. first claimed that Rebecca Nurse's specter was tormenting her, many in the community were genuinely shocked. How could such a saintly woman be a witch? The accusation seemed so absurd that surely it would be quickly dismissed. But the accusers, now emboldened by their previous successes and the attention they were receiving, doubled down on their claims. They described in vivid detail how Nurse's specter would appear to them, sometimes as a white-haired woman in a nursing cap, sometimes transformed into a bird or other creature, always bent on tormenting them and forcing them to sign the devil's book. The Nurse family and their friends rallied to Rebecca's defense, creating a petition signed by 39 of her neighbors, attesting to her good character and Christian behavior. The petition described her as a person whose life and conversation have been according to her profession, and we never had any cause or grounds to suspect her of any such thing as she is now accused of. But in the twisted logic of the witch trials, her very goodness became evidence of her evil. The reasoning was that Satan's most dangerous servants would be those who appeared most holy, those who could deceive the faithful through their false piety. The accusations against Rebecca Nurse revealed something terrifying about the nature of the witch hunt. No one was safe. If a woman universally regarded as a saint could be accused of witchcraft, then anyone could be next. The community began to look at neighbors they had known for years with new suspicion. Every disagreement, every moment of friction, every perceived slight became potential evidence of supernatural malevolence. The social fabric of Salem Village was unraveling, thread by thread, as fear and suspicion replaced trust in community bonds. Now, to understand what happened next, we need to examine the role of the magistrates and the special court that was established to handle the growing cascade of accusations. The local magistrates, John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin, had been overwhelmed by the number of cases flooding their court. By May 1692, the jails in Salem, Boston, and Cambridge were overflowing with accused witches. Men, women, and children were crowded into damp, filthy cells, often chained to the walls, surviving on meager rations while awaiting trial. The conditions were so bad that several people died in prison before they could be tried. Into this chaos stepped Sir William Phips, the newly appointed royal governor of Massachusetts. Phips had arrived in Boston on May 14, 1692, to find his colony in the grip of what appeared to be a supernatural emergency. A military man with limited education but considerable practical experience, Phips was ill-equipped to handle the complex legal and theological issues surrounding the witchcraft accusations. Feeling pressured to act decisively, he established the Court of Oyer and Terminer, meaning to hear and determine, and appointed William Stoughton as its Chief Justice. Stoughton was in many ways the perfect choice to lead the witch trials, if your goal was to ensure that as many people as possible would be executed. A Harvard-educated Puritan hardliner who had never married and devoted his life to rooting out sin and heresy, Stoughton approached the witch trials with the fervor of a true believer. He was utterly convinced that Salem was under assault by Satan's forces, and he saw the court as engaged in holy warfare against the powers of darkness. His rigid interpretation of Puritan theology left no room for doubt or mercy. Witches were enemies of God and man, and they deserved death. What made these trials particularly deadly was the court's acceptance of spectral evidence, in testimony that the accused person's spirit or specter was seen committing malevolent acts. This was a controversial legal principle even in 1692, with many legal scholars arguing that spectral evidence was inherently unreliable because Satan could potentially assume the shape of innocent people to deceive witnesses. But Stoughton and his fellow judges brushed aside these concerns, arguing that God would not allow the devil to impersonate the innocent so convincingly. The acceptance of spectral evidence created an impossible situation for the accused. How do you prove that your spirit wasn't tormenting someone? How do you defend against accusations of invisible crimes that allegedly took place in the supernatural realm? The accusers would often fall into fits during the trials, claiming that the accused was attacking them at that very moment through spectral means. The magistrates, convinced they were witnessing supernatural warfare in their own courtroom, saw these performances as definitive proof of guilt. The first person to be executed under the new court was Bridget Bishop on June 10, 1692. Bishop was an easy target for the witch hunters. She had been accused of witchcraft years earlier in a dispute with her neighbors. She operated a tavern that attracted criticism from the more conservative members of the community, and she dressed in a way that some considered immodest for a woman of her age. She wore a red bodice and had been seen working in her garden on Sundays, both of which were taken as signs of her ungodly nature. But Bishop's execution was significant for another reason, and marked the transition from accusation to execution, from imprisonment to death. The crowd that gathered at Proctor's Ledge to watch her hang was large and somber. Many had come to witness what they believed was divine justice being carried out against a servant of Satan. Others came out of morbid curiosity, to see how a witch would die. But some came with growing unease, beginning to wonder if the community had gone too far in its hunt for supernatural enemies. Bishop's execution opened the floodgates for more deaths. On July 19, 1692, 5 more people were hanged in a single day. Sarah Good, Elizabeth Howe, Susanna Martin, Rebecca Nurse, and Sarah Wilds. The community watched in horror as the gallows claimed the lives of people they had known and lived alongside for years. Sarah Good, the homeless beggar who had been one of the first accused, went to her death with characteristic defiance. When Reverend Nicholas Noyes urged her to confess and save her soul, she replied, "I am no more a witch than you are a wizard, and if you take away my life, God will give you blood to drink." The execution of Rebecca Nurse was particularly traumatic for Salem Village. Here was a woman who had been universally beloved, whose only crime seemed to be that she had been targeted by the afflicted accusers. As she was led to the gallows, many in the crowd wept openly. Her family continued to maintain her innocence, and her death began to plant seeds of doubt in the minds of some community members. If Rebecca Nurse could be executed as a witch, what did that say about the reliability of the accusations and the justice of the proceedings? The trials continued through the summer of 1692, with more executions following in August and September. Each death added to the growing sense that Salem had become trapped in a nightmare of its own making. The community was being torn apart by accusations and counter-accusations, by fear and suspicion, by the constant threat that anyone could be next. Families were divided as members turned on each other, and the social bonds that had held the community together for decades were dissolving under the pressure of supernatural terror. One of the most horrific executions was that of Giles Corey, the 80-year-old husband of accused witch Martha Corey. When Corey was brought to trial, he refused to enter a plea of guilty or not guilty, knowing that either plea would result in a trial that would likely end in his execution and the confiscation of his property. Under English law, a person who refused to enter a plea could be subjected to peine forte et dure, pressing with heavy weights until they either entered a plea or died. For 3 days, Corey was taken to a field near Salem Jail and laid on the ground with a board placed on his chest. Heavy stones were gradually added to the board, slowly crushing the life out of him. Each day the sheriff would ask if he was ready to enter a plea, and each day Corey would refuse. According to witnesses, his only words during the ordeal were more weight, either as a defiant gesture or as a way to hasten his death. By refusing to enter a plea, Corey ensured that his property would pass to his family rather than being confiscated by the court, but he paid for this legal maneuver with his life. The pressing of Giles Corey represented the absolute nadir of the Salem witch trials. Here was an elderly man being slowly crushed to death for refusing to participate in proceedings that had already claimed his wife's life. The brutality of his execution, carried out in full view of the community, began to turn public opinion against the trials. Even some of the most ardent supporters of the witch hunt began to question whether the pursuit of witches had gone too far. But here's where things get really interesting. The beginning of the end came not from outside intervention, but from within the community itself. As the accusations spread wider and began targeting more prominent members of society, including ministers, wealthy merchants, and even the wife of Governor Phipps himself, doubts began to emerge about the reliability of the accusers and the validity of spectral evidence. The turning point came when several of the accusers began to recant their stories. Mary Warren, a servant in the Proctor household who had been both an accuser and later accused herself, was pressed to explain her contradictory testimony. Under intense pressure from the magistrates, she admitted that she had been making up her visions and fits. When asked why she had lied, she gave an answer that cuts to the heart of the entire hysteria. "I thought I saw the apparitions at first, but looking upon them more steadily, I thought they vanished. But I was afraid to say so, for fear I should be accused of witchcraft myself." This admission was devastating because it revealed the catch-22 that had trapped the accusers. Once they had begun making accusations, they couldn't stop without admitting they had been lying, which would make them targets for accusations themselves. The fear of being accused had kept them trapped in a web of lies that grew more elaborate and deadly with each passing day. Other accusers began to crack under pressure. Sarah Churchill, another servant who had been one of the afflicted girls, admitted that she had been coached by her masters to make accusations. When pressed about the reality of her visions, she broke down and confessed, "They did threaten me, and told me that if I did not do so, they would put me into the dungeon and would not let me see the sun nor eat." The revelation that some of the accusers had been coerced or manipulated added another layer of horror to the already tragic proceedings. Increase Mather, one of the most influential Puritan ministers in Massachusetts and the father of the famous Cotton Mather, began to question the use of spectral evidence in witchcraft trials. In his treatise Cases of Conscience Concerning Evil Spirits, Mather argued that spectral evidence was inherently unreliable because Satan could potentially assume the shape of innocent people to deceive witnesses. He wrote, "It were better that 10 suspected witches should escape than that one innocent person should be condemned." This theological challenge to the foundations of the witch trials was significant because it came from within the Puritan establishment itself. Mather was not a skeptic or a radical pass. He was a pillar of the religious community whose opinions carried enormous weight with both clergy and magistrates. His critique of spectral evidence provided intellectual cover for others who had been harboring doubts about the trials, but had been afraid to speak out. The most telling moment in the collapse of the witch hunt came when the accusers began targeting people who were simply too prominent and well-connected to be believable as witches. When they accused Lady Phipps, the wife of the governor, the political calculus changed overnight. When they named prominent Boston ministers and wealthy merchants, the accusations began to seem less like revelations of supernatural evil and more like the desperate attempts of attention-seeking young women to maintain their power and influence. The final nail in the coffin of the witch trials came from an unexpected source: the accusers themselves. As the months wore on and the pressure to produce new names continued, the accusers began making increasingly wild and contradictory claims. They accused people who had been dead for years. They claimed to see witches in locations where dozens of witnesses could testify they had never been, and they began turning on each other with accusations of witchcraft. The breaking point came when the accusers claimed that the devil had appeared to them in the form of a minister, not just any minister, but one of the most respected clergy in the colony. This accusation was so outrageous, so obviously false, that it finally broke the spell that had held the community in thrall for nearly a year. If the accusers could make such obviously false claims about prominent ministers, what did that say about the reliability of their earlier accusations? By October 1692, The special court was dissolved, and Governor Phipps ordered that spectral evidence could no longer be used in witchcraft trials. The remaining accused witches were transferred to regular courts where the higher standards of evidence made convictions virtually impossible. In January 1693, Phipps pardoned all remaining accused witches and ordered their release from prison. The witch hunt that had terrorized Salem and the surrounding communities for nearly a year was finally over. The aftermath of the Salem witch trials reveals perhaps the most important part of this story: how a community begins to heal from the trauma of having turned on itself. The process was slow and painful, marked by years of legal battles, public apologies, and private reckonings with the horror of what had been done in the name of protecting the community from evil. In 1697, the Massachusetts General Court declared a day of fasting and prayer in repentance for the tragedy of the witch trials. The proclamation acknowledged that the colony had been led into error and asked for God's forgiveness for the innocent blood that had been shed. Samuel Sewall, one of the judges who had presided over the trials, publicly apologized for his role in the proceedings, standing in his church while his confession was read aloud to the congregation. The families of the victims fought for years to clear their names and receive compensation for their suffering. In 1711, the Massachusetts legislature passed a bill restoring the rights and good names of those who had been accused and executed, and providing financial compensation to their families. The amounts were modest: £20 for Rebecca Nurse's family, £6 for Sarah Good's family, but the symbolic importance of the gesture was enormous. Individual accusers also came forward with apologies and confessions. Ann Putnam Jr., who had been one of the most prolific accusers, publicly apologized in 1706 when she joined the Salem Village Church. Her confession, read aloud to the congregation, acknowledged that she had been instrumental with others in the prosecution of persons of whom I may have been mistaken, and asked for forgiveness from both God and the community. But for many in Salem, the experience left deep scars that never fully healed. Families that had been torn apart by accusations never fully reconciled. The community's trust in its own institutions and leaders was permanently damaged. The witch trials had revealed the dark potential that lurked beneath the surface of even the most pious and civilized communities, and that knowledge could never be completely forgotten. The story of what really happened during those terrifying months in 1692 is ultimately a story about the human capacity for both evil and redemption. The Salem witch trials weren't an isolated outbreak of superstition or ignorance. They were the product of a perfect storm of social tensions, religious extremism, personal vendettas, and mass hysteria. The witch trials revealed how quickly rational people can be swept up in collective madness, how accusations can become weapons, and how the vulnerable members of society are always the first targets when communities turn on themselves. The young accusers, initially perhaps genuinely disturbed by whatever psychological or social pressures they were experiencing, found themselves wielding unprecedented power in a society that normally silenced them completely. For girls and young women who had no voice in church, no say in politics, no control over their own futures, the witch trials offered an intoxicating taste of influence and attention. They could point a finger and watch adults scramble to respond, could level accusations and see respected members of the community dragged away in chains. The adults, convinced they were fighting a cosmic battle between good and evil, abandoned reason and due process in favor of spectral evidence and mass fear. Men like William Stoughton, who saw themselves as holy warriors protecting their communities from supernatural assault, became so invested in the reality of the witch threat that they couldn't acknowledge the possibility that they had been wrong. To admit that the witch trials had been a mistake would have meant acknowledging that their entire worldview was flawed, that their understanding of good and evil, of divine justice and human responsibility was fundamentally incorrect. The Salem witch trials teach us that the real danger in any community isn't supernatural evil. It's the all-too-human capacity for fear, prejudice, and the abuse of power to tear societies apart from within. When we look at what happened in Salem, we see how communities can become trapped in cycles of accusation and retaliation, how fear can be weaponized to settle old scores, and how the breakdown of social trust can lead to catastrophic consequences. The trials also reveal the particular vulnerability of marginal members of society when communities are under stress. The first accusations targeted an enslaved woman, a homeless beggar, and a bedridden woman who had violated social norms. People who had no powerful allies to protect them and no social standing to defend. As the accusations spread, they continued to disproportionately target women, particularly women who were seen as too independent, too outspoken, or too different from community norms. But perhaps the most chilling lesson of Salem is how easily it could happen again. The same social dynamics that fueled the witch trials, fear of the other, the weaponization of accusations, the abandonment of due process in favor of popular hysteria, the targeting of vulnerable populations, continue to surface in different forms throughout history. The names change, the specific accusations vary, but the underlying patterns remain disturbingly familiar. We see echoes of Salem in the Red Scares of the 20th century, when accusations of communist sympathy could destroy careers and lives. We see it in the moral panics that periodically sweep through communities, targeting everything from comic books to role-playing games to social media platforms. We see it in the way that fear and suspicion can be used to justify the persecution of minority groups, the abandonment of civil liberties, and the erosion of democratic norms. The incredible story of the Salem witch trials isn't just about what happened in a small Massachusetts village over 3 centuries ago. It's about the eternal struggle between fear and reason, between justice and vengeance, between the human capacity for compassion and the darker impulses that can emerge when communities feel threatened. It's a story that reminds us that the most dangerous monsters aren't supernatural, they're the ones